If you are wanting to understand what loneliness and social connection mean, please see the other video on YouTube about social connection as a human basic need. But for this video, I'm taking you through a step-by-step process about the loneliness research that we just published this last summer that described the underlying causes of loneliness in adults. And I found that people have a lot of questions about the research methods we use and if they're trustworthy or not. So I'm going to describe how we analyze the stories of over 200 adults about their experiences with loneliness and how that helped us to develop our results. So my name is Kyla Bauer. I spent 5 years in a PhD program trying to understand what is causing adult loneliness. And I just graduated this year, and I wanted to more broadly share our work in the community so that you can feel confident participating in these really important conversations that we're having about how do we be more socially connected. So it's notoriously hard to recruit really lonely people to research studies because they tend to feel a lot of shame around it and don't really want to talk about it. For the two research projects we are discussing today, I ended up using stories about loneliness that were actually collected by this artist in Canada. So Marissa Corda built a website to publicly share stories about loneliness that people around the world submitted to participate in her online art project. And she did it to destigmatize feeling lonely, really wanting people to feel free to talk openly about loneliness and accept that this really is a normal part of human life. So the artist posted an open-ended survey on Facebook and on her website that people could fill out that looked like this. It had 4 different prompts to help people share their different experiences with loneliness. It was done in English, and participants self-identified only their first name and ages, so we're treating them as anonymous participants. The art project was publicized internationally. Over 2,000 survey responses were submitted from 2017 to 2018, so this is pre-pandemic. The artist selected 300 to be publicly available based on stories that she found reflected the greatest diversity in ages, life experiences, and geographic location. Most survey responses were by adults self-identified as ages 18 to 65. So my first 2 research projects are analyzing these stories about loneliness that were collected by somebody else. And in research, we call this secondary data. A reason for doing this is to collect real-world information that would have otherwise not been shared in research. If I'm interviewing someone about loneliness and I'm telling them it's this problem that we're trying to get rid of, it immediately impacts the way that someone shares their story with me. So health researchers have found that people actually share more information about stigmatized health issues within these anonymous online communities. So I'm treating the Loneliness Project website as if it's an anonymous online community. I'm using an approach also in science called critical realism. So when I was first learning how do we do qualitative research where we're analyzing the stories that people tell about their lives, there's this general understanding that you really can't talk about what's causing what because your work is too subjective. But critical realism is a philosophy of science that rejects this idea. It's a philosophy about how do we produce good knowledge in science to solve problems in the real world. And to do that, we have to talk about the causes of problems. And it really rejects these divisions that can happen in science when we try to separate out what is subjective from what is objective about the world around us. As long as we can dig below the surface of our subjectivity to the underlying processes or structures that explain how a problem is or how an event came to be, our knowledge can be good enough to be effective at solving problems such as population health problems or crises. This approach, it blends the natural sciences like biology with our social sciences, and it allows qualitative research to help explain the underlying causes of health-related problems. And last, to help me, a social work researcher, a clinical social work researcher supervised our qualitative work to ensure that we included knowledge about relationships in our results. She is also an expert in qualitative research methods, so she helped supervise. We also had a research assistant who was trained in global health to help us think about a broader global perspective. So going back to those loneliness surveys, I was able to use 219 of them for my first two research projects. Most adults who filled them out were between the ages of 18 to 40, but ages up to 75 are represented. So my first research project was using the surveys from that website. I examined patterns in social interactions that are described by adults when they felt lonely. These observations that were made about their social interactions actually gave us insight into core quality issues that were contributing to feeling lonely. So this is the research method we used. Thematic analysis can be really useful to produce clear results that can later on be used to support a variety of research methods across a wide variety of disciplines. This method was adapted to that philosophy of science I talked about, critical realism. We primarily use theory from this model you see on the left. It's called the social exposé model, and it describes how it's possible for an individual like me to be physically exposed to this larger social world that we call a society. So if I go to school in Denver, Colorado, my society is all of the people in the Denver metro area, the places we go to, all of the government institutions, our economy, our education system, our judicial system, all of these larger structures that organize us as a society and how we all live physically together in our day-to-day lives. Yes, it can include our larger social networks that we might engage with online or by phone. But it is possible for a society to directly impact my health through all of the people and social interactions that I physically come into contact with on a regular basis. It's called social interactions, and it includes the people or actors that I'm interacting with, the places where our interactions are taking place, the time we are interacting for, and the qualities. What did it feel like for us to interact? So a critical realist approach integrates this theory into the analysis itself. We already know social interactions can be a direct pathway for how our relationships impact our own individual health. So I can incorporate this into the analysis by looking for its key parts in the stories that people tell. Who was involved in these stories of loneliness? Where did the loneliness happen? At what time in their life? For how long? And then what was the quality of the interaction that contributed to someone feeling lonely? This is what the method looks like. So an adult wrote a story about the first time they felt lonely. It describes a social interaction that happened as a child at school. It was with a teacher when the child told the teacher that they were gay, and the teacher looked at him with, quote, repulsion. So with thematic analysis, we broke up loneliness stories into distinct ideas about these social interactions that resulted in feeling lonely. These distinct ideas, we call them codes, that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. In this way, myself and a research assistant, we actually independently coded social interactions that were taking place in all 219 surveys. Every week we met together with a research advisor to review our codes, incorporating all of our perspectives on what we called them and how we defined them. The language that we used, we tried to make it as close as possible to the language that was being used by people filling out these surveys. Once we had coded and reviewed 83 surveys, we actually found that we were no longer finding any new ideas. So this means after 83 surveys, we had already gotten enough information to develop our results. But just to be sure, we still split up the additional 136 surveys, still finding no changes in our results. So after coding 219 surveys, we ended up with a total of 105 distinct ideas or codes about social interactions within lonely experiences. To make sense of them, I looked for ways in which their definitions overlapped and grouped them into these shared categories. And this helped our research team discuss, well, what are the quality issues that are happening in social interactions that adults are saying contribute to their loneliness? So you can see our category of rejection include codes of rejection, mistreatment or abuse, being let down, being left out, and serious breakup as examples. Okay. So these are our results. There were a total of 15 themes that were found in our data. These themes reflect a deeper meaning of ideas that were consistently found across surveys. So some themes describe the experience of loneliness, like what it felt like. Some describe the responses to loneliness. How did people cope or react when they felt lonely? And 9 of the themes improved explanation of the underlying causes of loneliness. How do we know that? Because 40 years of loneliness research has established that loneliness results from quality issues in relationships. So these themes are explaining quality issues as observed by lonely adults. And I'm now going to talk about them and provide specific examples. Rejection of who I truly am is a social interaction quality that resulted in feeling lonely. Rejection included feeling criticized or disregarded, being bullied or abused, or having a significant break in trust. It ultimately felt like a rejection of the self, a judgment on who a person is, or a dismissal that they do not matter. Being present but emotionally absent is another quality resulting in feeling lonely. This emphasized the need that connection really needs to be emotional. So it describes when relationships have nothing in common, when they're too busy to spend time together, when they're inauthentic, and they can leave a person feeling ignored or invisible by other people. Excessive labor was when adults were faced with workloads that exceeded their capacity. So these situations could occur in work settings, when living alone, or due to being a primary caretaker. Adults could feel used or overwhelmed by other people. Loss described losing relationships due to death, breakups, moving, or feeling left behind. So feelings of grief were really common in these interactions. Within loneliness stories, those 4 specific qualities were being compared to only one positive quality. Adults said that they needed to be cared for by having an authentic understanding of who a person is. Adults wanted to be paid attention to, seen, talked to, hugged, have their hand held, show up, and share in their life experiences. In our results, we actually identified additional themes that are describing a larger process or structural issue that is contributing to social interactions having poor qualities. So, what this means is that there might be some underlying force that is driving people to experience more rejection from other people, or that is driving people to experience more loss of relationships with other people. One of these larger underlying processes was breaking expectations of dominant social narratives. And it described when cultures, religion, policies, and laws established a social expectation that a person could break. Breaking expectations could lead to poor quality and how other people interacted with you. So, for example, a person in our study described a cultural expectation about being a girl and how it impacted how her parents treated her. Major life events could transition an adult social life that was beyond their ability to control. So, an event like living in New York during 9/11 could change someone's ability to connect to others or how they were treated. There could be physical barriers to connection, such as technology, buildings, physical distances. People often describe feeling trapped in physical isolation. Social isolation described when an adult had very few total relationships, such as having no family or friends to spend time with. People describe feeling completely detached without a social structure in place. So this could happen if somebody moved quite frequently, or as someone got older, sometimes the larger family, as people passed away, became smaller and smaller and smaller. So, to summarize the overall results, we use qualitative research to further explain what's already known about loneliness, that loneliness is caused by a discrepancy in quality of relationships. Our study sample found 4 specific ways that social interactions can deviate from being cared for by others, resulting in loneliness. And these qualities could range in severity. So, rejection of who I truly am could just be a one off. social interaction in which someone feels like they're being left out by a friend group to really severe instances of abuse. So while these results helped us describe an immediate cause of loneliness, looking at the quality of social interactions, we found that there were these larger social processes and underlying structures that may be important to understand why people are experiencing poor quality in their social environments, especially if that poor quality is overall having some pretty big changes. How can we learn more about that? These results also don't explain the difference between a loneliness experience that is totally adaptable, um, that's not going to have a big impact on someone's life overall, versus a critical threshold when someone is starting to experience really serious deprivation in social connection that might be having a pretty big impact on their overall well-being and health. So we did a follow-up research project that is complementary to help answer those specific questions. We examined patterns in social systems described by adults about their loneliness experiences. So using the same data, that survey data, I want to gain a more systems or comprehensive understanding of what's going on in the whole social environment that adults observe when feeling lonely. Thematic narrative inquiry, it's a completely different qualitative research method, and it's often paired with the method that I used in our first research project in order to have a richer understanding of the same real-world data. Narrative inquiry is designed to capture a whole social environment because it doesn't just care about our individual experiences, it also cares about the environmental or social context that is shaping this experience. And is able to do this by keeping our stories intact as whole stories, even if they're really short stories, by framing it with theory. So to explain this method more, we already have theory that organizes social interactions happening across society to understand how together they can ultimately result in loneliness. In public health, we talk about living in a society within the social ecological model. That's the picture shown on this slide here. By organizing our social environment, it's actually easier to understand what do we mean by a society and what makes up a society. We do this because when scientists are talking about our dependence on the societies in which we live, that is critical to our survival as a social species, they're talking about a society that is made up of cooperative and interdependent interactions among large groups of people who live together. So it's not only our family and friends that are critical to our survival, it's all of society. Relational means close relationships like our family and friends, of course. Community means community spaces or organizations where there are a lot of social interactions taking place. Like think of school as both a physical place that people can go to, as well as kind of a network of people who all kind of know who each other are, our workplace, our social clubs, things like that. And then societal, this is where the abstract things happen that can tie us together as a society. Um, they may not have a physical form. So think about the things that we value as a culture in our societies, or our social norms about how we're expected to interact with other people when we're driving down a highway, for example. Um, these kinds of abstract things, our norms, our values, they influence how we interact with each other in a society. Moving on to how we incorporated this into our analysis. So remember this from the first research project. We broke up this story into different ideas when we talked about the social interaction that a young gay child described that he had with his teacher. We can visualize it. John Doe described one social interaction he had as a child with his teacher when he felt rejected by his teacher. But instead of doing that, here's the same survey that this man filled out about his loneliness experiences across his lifetime. Even though there are 4 different sections that he filled out that could be 4 different very times in his life, we actually analyzed the entire survey as one story together. The entire survey is reviewed to ask, what is this man saying about his whole social environment that contributes to loneliness, even across time from childhood to adulthood? In his survey response, the contributing factor of loneliness is stigma and how it's linked to being mistreated in society. And a second contributing factor is moving to a new place, and we created labels for each of these overarching factors. Again, we can visualize it. So this man's loneliness story describes a stigma. You can read the quote there. He says, "I'm a gay man in a generally homophobic country where statements like gays are worse than dogs and pigs are thrown around and people wildly clap," end quote. And he initially talks about being at college that is a community environment that's accepting of gay men and the positive impact it has on his ability to date and make friends. After graduating, he moves back home to a small town that stigmatizes gay men, and he is unable to date and find friendships safely. By visualizing these different factors together, um, in this case, stigma and a big move, we can understand how they impact each of these three levels. So it makes a big difference what kind of environment someone is in. For each, and then beyond this specific survey response, for every survey that shared a label, like every survey we found where there was a big move involved, I can compare those stories that all had a big move in them and what they have in common. And then my results can summarize each of these labels. So I presented summaries of these labels to the research team who reviewed and discussed each one to get their input. And I followed steps to ensure they included common and significant ideas that our research team found within each of them in our discussions. We also did something called a co-occurrence analysis, and if you're really interested in how this is done, feel free to ask more about it. So our results found a total of 5 distinct labels in our study sample of 219 lonely adults that further explained why they were feeling lonely within a society. Major health problem described when adults lost their bodies to physical or mental health issues. This label described a society of physical isolation. So at the societal level, dominant social narratives describe cultures that struggle to take the time to understand and include people who have different capacities to participate. In communities, if adults became housebound, they could lose their entire exposure to this social environment. In personal relationships, those who felt they lacked any control over their bodies or abilities expressed fear in how to connect in intimate relationships moving forward. Big moves in small families describe when adults experience significant relationship loss due to both death and moving away. So many would describe long periods of time that they would spend alone on evenings, weekends, holidays, and for significant life events. This label described a society of social isolation. So at the societal level, dominant social narratives primarily centered around expectations about the family that an individual should be experiencing that they may not actually have. In communities, adults could end up without any family members, which could leave them feeling confused about how do I participate in the community, or they could be required to move often for work that made it difficult to retain relationships. In personal relationships, adults with no families express fear and how to get help with serious life concerns like preparing for old age. Stigma, mistreatment, or abuse resulted in adults feeling like there was something wrong with them. So this could include severe physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. And there were a very large number of identities and experiences that could be stigmatized. At the societal level, adults would identify a stigma to explain why they were being mistreated in society, such as a culture that stigmatizes people who are considered overweight. In communities, mistreatment or abuse could happen in community spaces, and it could get worse if individuals couldn't find the help that they needed. In personal relationships, mistreatment or abuse was most commonly talked about in relationships with parents in childhood. Caregiving beyond my capacity described excessive labor demands from a job or as a primary caregiver. Labor demands may be paid or unpaid, and suicide was most often brought up in this label. Caregiving beyond my capacity describes a society of sacrifice. So, at the societal level, adults face social pressures to sacrifice for others without support to meet these expectations. And I think that's an important difference to note. In communities, this was seen in demanding jobs or education. And in personal relationships, this was seen in being the sole primary caretaker for other people. Fitting in was the most difficult story to capture because it was about the absence of something. So adults could have relationships, but would find them unfulfilling and, didn't really always have a reason to pinpoint why that was happening. So when adults hadn't found a sense of connection over the course of their entire life, their whole identity could become about not fitting into the world around them. Fitting in described a society of absence. So, at the societal level, adults were unable to find others who shared the same language, culture, values, or life experiences. They would often give themselves labels to demonstrate how much they stood out. In communities, individuals and the communities around them could mutually not understand each other. In personal relationships, someone could be physically surrounded by family and friends, but there would be an absence in directly interacting with that person. So, critical realism asks us to take these results one step further. How do all five labels improve explanation of the underlying causes of loneliness that we already have theory about? We found that when adults felt lonely, they described becoming socially excluded as an individual from a whole social environment to the margins of society. One individual could fracture off from an entire society. So, exposure to poor quality interactions could actually accumulate across these different levels of society and over time from childhood to adulthood. This aligns with a broad definition of marginalization. Marginalization in our results could be intentional or unintentional. It could be mutual, and it could be used as an accountability tool to steer people towards social expectations for better or worse. Also, a single individual could experience the compounding of multiple problems. So, physical isolation and social isolation and being mistreated, et cetera, et cetera. This seems to align with what we in public health call intersectionality. So, intersectionality is when someone has multiple ways of being marginalized that can increase the amount of overall stressful life experiences that they have. But instead of focusing on people's identities, like their demographics of class, race, gender, etc., what our results are doing instead are describing the intersection of distinct types of social environments that are contributing to loneliness. So keep in mind that all research has its limitations. And the main limitation for both of our research studies is we can only verify that our results apply to this specific group of people who filled out these surveys. We don't have a whole lot of information to know who exactly these people are. So we don't have any demographic information because they are anonymous. However, we did incorporate the theory that I explained into our analysis that is capable of capturing social connection as a human basic need so that our results could possibly apply to any adult. So we can use these results to examine, are they showing up in other kinds of populations where we do have their demographic data? Also, the people who decided to participate in this art project and the artist's choices on which stories to publicly share may have selected for people who are different than a general population. So I'm not going to talk about my last research project. Once it's published, I'll post a video about it too. But in this last project, I wanted to understand how these results compare to a population where we do know who the people are. So I was able to develop results for a specific population of people and compare them to our anonymous group. But for the sake of time, I'm going to just stop the video here. So I created this YouTube channel where I'm posting videos about my research and about public health. If you are interested in learning more, I will be posting here. You are welcome to send me feedback on improvements and things like that. Just keep in mind, do not send any private or personal information because it won't be protected. And I will stop there. Thank you so much for your time and listening.